Hi everyone, welcome. We're going to be talking about the last tier list for this episode, and this one's a new one. So it's not an update. We're going to be talking about archetypes, so legendary weapon archetypes. I've been meaning to do this tier list for a really long time because I think it's one of the most interesting. Obviously, talking about weapons, individual weapons, like, what's the best sniper or what's the best shotgun, pretty interesting. But I think comparing actual legendary weapon archetypes and looking at heavy GLs, looking at machine guns, looking at how ammo efficient they are, how much you get per brick pickup, what's their total damage to miners, what's their total damage to elites, bosses. There's all these different things that you can compare. I don't think anyone's ever made a video like this that is at this level of macro that encompasses the entire sandbox. So as a result, not only will I be making this video, I'm also planning on making another video where I analyze my results from all of this. I have some really cool graphs to show you guys, and maybe make some direct suggestions with actual strict quantities when it comes to, what archetypes need buffs, what's overperforming, what's underperforming, whether it's like lightweight shotguns or rapid fire GLs or like anything really, based on the numbers that we have here. Maybe try to rebalance the game on our own terms. So pretty interesting stuff. But for now, we're going to be talking about this tier list. There are approximately, I believe, there's 78 archetypes in this game, so quite a few of them. I know I just spoiled the entire tier list for you guys, but you guys, I think you're mostly here for the analysis anyways. In terms of exceptions, there are a couple things where I left some stuff out. I left out like Together Forever, like the Mida synergy frame, because it doesn't really do much. Some frames, some lightweight versions of like already existing versions I did include. For the most part, they're like in the same tier as their original version, so it doesn't really make a difference, right? Like having higher base handling and like a movement speed bonus is not going to move you up or down a tier. So just so you know, if there's some stuff missing here, like, the Together Forever frame, that's why it's not here. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's actually talk about the tier list itself. So if we're going to rank tier list legendary weapon archetypes, it's quite difficult to compare them because when we made the exotic weapon tier list, for example, I said that it was difficult compared to legendary weapons because exotic weapons all seek to do different things. And legendary weapon archetypes have the same problem, right? How can you compare a rocket sidearm and an area denial frame and a rocket and like a machine gun? They all do different things. So how do you rank them against each other? So I will tell you the factors that I and my chat kind of came up with that we think are the best representatives of legendary weapon performance. So number one is relevant enemy type DPS. So obviously we're not going to care about rocket sidearms having very mediocre boss DPS because you're not using a rocket sidearm for boss DPS. But there are some weapons where you might use it for minor DPS and boss DPS. So we take both of those things into account. And then obviously for some weapons like maybe like hand cannons or maybe like snipers, you want to take into account elite DPS, so champ data as well. So if you're using it in like a GM, or even if you're doing it like a raid encounter, you got to defeat like not a full scale boss, just like a major or like an elite, then this middle column becomes more relevant, but obviously less frequent than the other two. So relevant, when I say relevant, machine guns, we're not going to care too much about their boss DPS. We're going to care a lot more about their minor DPS, right? Total damage. So here I've included two columns. I think elite total is largely not really relevant. So we have minor total damage. So obviously machine guns, you can see they're absolutely excellent for minor total damage because they have a 1.94 times scalar when we're comparing boss damage to minor damage. And then we have boss total damage, right? Which is more relevant for maybe something like a rapid fire shotgun or maybe something like a sword. Finally, we have damage wise per brick damage. So this is really interesting. A lot of this data, by the way, was grabbed from the Mossy spreadsheet for outgoing damage scaling. There's the Quantum spreadsheet. I'll link them all in the description for you guys so you guys can take a look. But a lot of this is thanks to their work. I just kind of scraped some of their numbers, combined them with my boss DPS numbers that I measured. So really interesting stuff. If you're kind of into the details and the numbers, you can go take a look at those spreadsheets too. So the per brick damage here, this is the average amount of ammo you are going to get from a regular brick pickup. So an RNG brick, not a finder brick. And when you pick up that brick, how much actual translated damage are you going to get from that pickup? So, Destiny players, Destiny content creators have talked about ammo efficiency in the past before, but this is a real quantifiable metric. This is specifically boss damage, but minor damage you can kind of extrapolate as well. It'll kind of bleed into this area. So pretty cool stuff. Excited to talk about that as well. There's some range and reload stuff, which not as important, right? Average reload really only plays into stuff where it's really bad, right? So I'm talking stuff like aggressive hand cannons, aggressive scout rifles, certain shotgun archetypes, machine guns, right? You can see machine guns have a horrible average reload, right? So I have a friend, Mario Will Die from my Twitch chat. He, I think, wrote a script and he got like the average base reload of every weapon from every single archetype. And so we plug them into here. That's what the numbers that you're seeing are. Range only really matters when members within the same weapon family have different range values, and they're so substantially different that, you know, it might actually factor into how usable that they are. I was kind of curious about this, and I was kind of curious whether, like, for example, rapid fire machine guns and high impact machine guns, given their damage profiles, have very different range values. In reality, not really. Kind of a curiosity thing. This mostly didn't factor, but we'll talk about that as well. And then obviously I have like an example of every single thing here. In terms of other stuff, another factor I don't have listed here is kind of a subjective one. It's going to be feel and quality of life. And now I think most of the community agrees that certain archetypes just don't feel right or feel really clunky to use. So that factors in a little bit for sure, especially on stuff like primaries. So I'm talking about stuff like aggressive hand cannons, aggressive glaives, high impact pulses, high impact scouts. I'm pretty sure you guys are pretty familiar with what I'm talking about, the feeling I'm referring to. And finally, we have miscellaneous factors. So this is stuff that's kind of like X factor stuff. You can't really talk about it. Similar reason with like exotic weapons, where I said you can't really account for some of these things, like some of the goals that these weapons are trying to achieve. And some of these weapons, like for example, Lost Signal, right? Really good for transcendence building. That's something you can't really quantify here. Movement stuff for like mounted top and micro missile frames, not something you can really, you know, quantify here. So again, that stuff, we'll talk about it when we get to the individual archetypes and we'll mention it there. So with that out of the way, really long intro, but I think it was kind of necessary for a very detailed and interesting tier list like this. Instead of going in the traditional format where I go over every single like weapon archetype and I just place them, I kind of spoiled everything at the start, but I'm going to like talk about why I put everything in certain tiers. So let's start with the S tier. So S tier, there's only 4, right? And you guys know how I like my S tiers. I like them very exclusive, very clean, best of the best, meta defining stuff. And so we'll talk about why stuff is here. So first we have adaptive heavy GLs and aggressive rockets. Now, these two kind of represent optimal burst damage in both solo and fireteam content. So obviously the GL, I'm more talking about solo content, and the aggressive rocket, I'm more talking about fireteam content. Now the aggressive rocket, I'm talking specifically with bipod swapping. You'll notice here that the total damage on aggressive rockets is actually not very good compared to something like an adaptive heavy GL, especially considering the fact that you have a pack hunter buff, right? Now, if you take into account bipod swapping, which currently hasn't been patched yet, then aggressive rockets actually have much more competitive total damage. It's like 1.5 times this number. And on top of that, they have great DPS. This DPS stuff you can kind of ignore. This is with manual reloads, as you can see in the notes here. Rockets actually have 1.5 to 2 to even higher times the damage that you see here when they're not manually reloaded. So when you use stuff like Envious, Reconstruction, you know, grapple reloading, swapping, all that sort of stuff is going to be taken into account here, and that's going to increase the DPS by a lot more. So aggressive rockets, you know, they're the best of the best, highest damage per shot. Adaptives, slightly better than rapids. We're going to talk about that more when we reach the A tier, but for now, that's why these are in the S tier. Rapid fire shotguns. Now, the actual damage profile of this weapon, it's not super impressive, right? Total damage is just kind of okay, right? Not great. DPS wise, pretty strong, but again, it's a rapid fire shotgun, so you have to be close range, you know, not really much competition for this archetype. But the main reason why this is here is because we are in a 1-2 punch meta on a lot of subclasses, on a lot of builds, and because of that, rapid fire shotguns, they do offer the highest total shot count by far of any shotgun archetype, and they're pretty easy to use. They can be used with, you know, non 1-2 punch perks as well. You know, you can use it with like trench barrel if you want. So there's a lot of different perks that you can use on these things, and the damage profile will kind of suit them very well. No matter what you kind of use them in. So rapid fire shotguns, S tier, they're kind of like an enabler archetype, but in terms of like the special effects that they actually provide, nothing too crazy. And then of course, you know, the archetype that probably everyone expected to be an S tier, despite the finder ammo nerfs, right? I think rocket sidearms are still undoubtedly some of the best ad clear options in the game. Certainly, if we're talking legendary options, they are the best and most versatile, universally applicable option in the game. If we look at the total damage of a rocket sidearm to miners, it's kind of mind-boggling that a special weapon does more total damage to red bars than something like a heavy GL or a rocket with pack hunter. That doesn't really make sense or compute in my head to me. That is part of the reason why, you know, rocket sidearms are so phenomenally good and so praised by everyone. Until they get nerfed in terms of like total damage or ammo efficiency, kind of makes sense why they're up here. Again, look at that per brick damage, pretty crazy stuff, right? It's similar to like adaptive heavy GLs. So pretty crazy stuff. That's the S tier. We're going to move on to the A tier. A tier is a lot fatter. The description I've written here for the A tier is useful niches. We have S alternatives, so archetypes that are similar to the stuff in S tier, just maybe like a little bit worse. And then we have non-universal good archetypes. So what I mean by that is an archetype of weapon that is pretty solid, but you're not going to use it in all content. You're going to use it in some content. So for example, machine guns, right? Machine guns, you're going to use them when you really, really care about, you know, prioritizing total damage to minors, and when you don't need a heavy weapon that's suited for boss DPS. So that's not always all content, right? For example, in a raid, you might not be able to afford using a machine gun because you need a heavy weapon that does, you know, packs more of a punch when it comes to boss DPS. So that's kind of why we have things situated the way we do here. Machine guns are in the A tier and not in the S tier for that reason. First, we have area denial frame. We already talked about this, but you know, darkness transcendence build, pretty good. Basically like a legendary wither horde. Excellent total damage to both minors and bosses for a special weapon. Ammo efficient splash ad clear. I mean, just very versatile. I wouldn't say this is like meta defining or anything, but pretty cool. And I'm excited to see what Bungie reveals when it comes to other options with this same frame. Lost Signal was already pretty good. It had auto loading, right? They could have kept that for a later release, but they gave it to Lost Signal. So already pretty good stuff. I think a lot of low man / solo people are happy with this, right? Gets you transcendence really fast. So yeah, A tier pick, pretty straightforward. Micro missile, if I can find that. Micro missile's right here. Mountaintop frame. I would say for major burst and boss damage, not super relevant. Reach GLs in general, I think do need a little bit of a buff. But micro missile frame, mostly here because it's also used for movement. If it was not that versatile, I'd probably shift it down a little bit to where the double fires are, not to spoil anything. But yeah, micro missile, a little bit versatile. Rapid fire heavy GL. So you might be wondering, if you actually look at the rapid fire heavy GL numbers, and we look at the DPS and we look at the total damage, the DPS to bosses is like 83.8k, and adaptives have a little bit less, right? And then you look at the total damage, adaptives have like 1.3 mil, and then you go to rapid fire GLs and it's like 12.7 mil. So what's the holdup, right? They're basically the same. Why did I not put rapid fire GLs in the S tier? Well, the main thing is that rapid fire GLs, if you look carefully here, have a total of 38 shots, while adaptive heavy GLs have a total of 31 shots. And despite them having similar levels of total damage, a lower shot count and a similar mag size, right? Both of them hit around 8 in the mag. If you have backup mag and like augmented, or like, you know, you have adept mag and spike, they hit 8 in the mag, right? So it's a lot easier to encompass a larger portion of your total reserves with a perk like Envious with an adaptive heavy GL compared to something like a rapid. And while this might not be super noticeable to most people, if you do damage testing like I do, it's very noticeable, because if you use something like an adaptive heavy GL, you might be able to get all of your reserves off on a boss in just one reload. Whereas if something like a rapid fire heavy GL, it's more like 3 reloads. So because of that, it can be kind of iffy. I will say though, if you guys kind of take a look at the archetypes here, Bungie kind of perceives rapid fire heavy GLs as being like underserved right now, or kind of like weak. But if they give rapid fire heavy GLs just like a buff of any sort at all, they will just kind of be objectively better than adaptives. The only reason I place them lower here is because they're essentially the same, and there's like a quality of life thing where adaptives are a little bit better in a very niche regard, right? So yeah, that's why rapid fires are here. Also, obviously, we don't really have a strong universal rapid fire. Caraxis is a thing with enhanced surrounded, but we don't have one with like chaos reshaped or bait yet, right? So that's why rapid fires are kind of out of the limelight for now. But I think Bungie might be, you know, conflating usage rate with like lack of a good option. But that's talk for another time. Heavy burst hand cannons are also in the A tier, as the only legendary primary archetype to actually meaningfully participate in boss DPS. That's why they're here. I mean, obviously the boss DPS number is low, but you know why they're here. Lucky pants, right? Warden's Law. And obviously they're quite usable for just regular minor DPS too, right? If you want to do ad clear, they do great elite DPS, great minor DPS. I know it's kind of hard to have a reference for these because there's barely any primaries up here, but just take my word for it, right? Minor DPS pretty good, elite DPS good because it's a hand cannon. So they do lose out a little bit to 180 RPM hand cannons, which is a bit surprising. Usually in the Bungie world, higher RPM, newer archetype means just better DPS with no drawback. But yeah, these are a little bit worse, but again, 180s are worse for boss DPS, so that's all she wrote for the A tier. LMGs. I already talked about this. LMGs are excellent minor total damage here. And the reason for that is because they do 1.94 times more damage to red bars than they do to bosses, which is, I think, the highest scaler of any legendary weapon archetype. If you look at stuff like shotguns, it's like 40% more. If you look at rockets, it's like 28% more, right? Even the famous rocket sidearm, it's only 67% more, right? So machine guns have a crazy inflated performance, I guess, towards red bars, which is why I placed them in the A tier. They're obviously very good here. This number is insanely high, right? That's why it's so green on the conditional format. Very high compared to the other weapons here. And yeah, machine guns are really good. You may notice all of the machine gun archetypes are present here except for rapids. The reason is I think rapids have slight recoil control issues on some examples of the rapid fire LMG. That's number one. And number two, while they do increase the damage rather substantially of a machine gun, I do think they do compromise a little bit too much on total damage to really make the selling point of a machine gun. Because in my opinion, when most people use machine guns, they're not going, oh, you know, I expect this thing to shred ads insanely fast like a rocket would. You know, they all kind of do the same job, right? They're kind of single target weapons, high impact and aggressive and adaptive. All these machine guns kind of feel the same. So the DPS difference is not super major, but the total damage difference, that will matter. That will matter. That is what you're using a machine gun for. That follows the identity of a machine gun. So that's why I knocked rapid fires down a tier. And obviously for boss damage, they're not really relevant either way. So I'm not going to put rapid fires higher or give them credit for that. Adaptive rockets are here. I think it's pretty straightforward why adaptive rockets are here. I described this tier as being like worse versions or S alternatives. Adaptive rockets are an alternative to aggressive rockets. They have less total damage, same damage per shot. Nothing much really needs to be said here. Adaptive, caster, and waveframe swords. Okay, so these are the last three archetypes in the A tier. These three are all in this tier for different reasons, right? Obviously, their boss DPS and their minor DPS values are pretty respectable just off the bat, so that already puts them in good graces. Their total damage values are really, really, really good. They're not really represented here because obviously rockets don't have access to an ammo regen perk. Swords have relentless strikes, and relentless strikes, I haven't made a video about this. I might make a YouTube short or something in the future, but my relentless testing was wrong initially. When I made the testing every legendary weapon or whatever for damage video, it was actually wrong. Relentless strikes is even better. It's even better than I gave it credit for in that video. Remember how I said that relentless strikes, if you're spamming light attacks, triples sword total damage? It's actually more than triple. It's actually more, it's like 4 times or something. So it's insane. This number should really even be like way higher than machine guns. This is with no relentless strikes at all. So yeah, just keep that in mind when we're talking about swords. They're very, 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 very high total damage weapons with relentless and pack hunter. And then for DPS, they're not bad either, right? So you might be asking, why are wave, caster, and adaptive here if waveframe is clearly the best of the three, just number wise, right? Well, we've talked about this before, but waveframes do not function correctly when a bunch of people are using them. Only one person will get the increased damage, while the other people will basically just get the regular attacks and not the waves. And it seems to be quite punishing. Even if people space out their wave attacks, it eats out most of the damage. So realistically speaking, waveframes are excellent for solo. They have excellent ammo economy, so great for solo. Casters, I put them here because they are technically slightly better than adaptives, and they have a lot better consistency when it comes to bosses where your sword can pierce through, right? So if we're talking a boss like Crota, for example, if you've ever done bequest damage on Crota, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Your right click will just go straight through the boss, or you'll track to some random thing and like you'll just do less damage. Basically, your heavy attack won't fully hit all of its damage ticks on the boss. Whereas casters don't really have this problem unless the boss like teleports out of your attack, which no sword can really handle that, so it doesn't really matter. Now, the reason why adaptives are in this tier, despite the fact that I basically just said casters have better damage and are better consistency, is because adaptives also have bequest. If we ever get a caster that gets 10 impact for free for no reason, I will be certain to probably move adaptives lower. But for now, adaptives will stay in this tier because bequest increases this number by like 10 to 13% or something like that. So technically better than casters, even if it means a little bit less consistency. Bunch of different reasons, but all three of these are here because they are the best performing sword representatives for various reasons or use cases. Long yap session for the A tier. We're gonna move on to the B tier. So any tier below A, explanations are probably going to get shorter because I think it's going to be more self-explanatory, especially towards the very, very low tiers. It's going to be like a lot of primaries that kind of just are not very good. So not much to talk about. Anyways, B tier description, outclassed or uncommon niches, and then also excellent primaries. First up, we have support auto rifle. Support auto rifle, I mean, I've already told you guys what I think about this, but you can give a universal 10% buff to your teammates. You can give them cure, you can give them resto, and despite all these things, all these nice and wonderful things that the support auto rifle does, it also has good minor DPS, right? It has respectable elite DPS. 21k-ish minor DPS is very respectable, better than all the other auto rifle archetypes, and on top of the cool benefits that it gives. So I'm going to talk about this later when I talk about the sandbox video where we go over like suggestions, improvements, whatever. But Bungie has this habit of creating new archetypes that are just objectively better than all the other archetypes within a weapons family. The support auto rifle is an example of that, right? Support auto rifle, it does increase the diversity, I suppose, of the playstyles that you can have when using legendary weapons. It kind of has almost like an exotic effect, but it also is just like better than all the other autos and has no drawback. I guess the drawback is it's like it's a projectile weapon, but that's not really like a drawback in my opinion. We have waveframe special GLs. Yeah, waveframe special GLs. These have been overshadowed by rocket sidearms by a lot. They're still decent for clearing ads in a line in low level content. I think they really do fall off in upper level content compared to stuff like rocket sidearms for obvious reasons. If you can't one-shot ads with this thing, the kill potency of it becomes a lot lower. So yeah, waveframes are still pretty strong, right? We have Martyr's Retribution, which just came out today. Yeah, it's still pretty good, but I would say it fits the description of like outclassed or uncommon niches pretty well, because rocket sidearms kind of do the job of waveframes. And of course, if you realize, even if you account for the fact that you can hit multiple ads in one wave, the total damage of a waveframe GL is not very high. Like 696 is pretty pitiful. 140 and 180 RPM hand cannons. So 140s would be the adaptive and lightweight, so the Rose archetype, and the typical 140s like Fatebringer. And then you have the 180 RPM hand cannons, so like Posterity. Now, I know a lot of people have problems with the 180 RPM weird recoil situation that it has going on. I know a lot of people say they hate using this hand cannon, but for the people that are capable of handling the recoil, the very weird recoil animation of this hand cannon that makes it almost feel like not like a hand cannon really, it has a really good damage profile. It has a really good damage profile. And I was under the impression, by the way, that like some weapon families, for example, hand cannons, like a precision hand cannon would have a significantly lower range than something like a 140 hand cannon, because it has a higher fire rate and a better damage profile. That's typically how Bungie balances things. Well, I looked at the range, and the range is like literally the exact same. It's like the exact same, right? To the meter, it's the exact same. So there's really no downside to using a 180 RPM hand cannon, besides like the feeling of using one. So it would be a disservice to put the precision hand cannon any lower than the adaptive and lightweights. Now you might be wondering, some of these, the auto rifle, you kind of get it, right? Because it gives you the buffs, right? It gives you the healing, the 10% buff. It has a decent damage profile. But why are the hand cannons here, right? The hand cannons literally, some of them have lower minor DPS than the auto rifle. The reason why hand cannons are here is two things. The first thing is hand cannons have good per shot damage. And per shot damage, while it's maybe not like super noticeable in some content, being able to one-shot ads versus two-shotting ads or multi-shotting ads can be a big difference when it comes to activating on-kill perks, or when it comes to just the feeling of using a weapon and your uptime and your movement between engagements. So hand cannons have that. That's number one. Number two, hand cannons also have proportionally much higher elite DPS compared to other weapon archetypes that are in the primary ammo type, you know what I mean? So because of that, hand cannons, you can see here that these numbers are significantly darker than, for example, the auto rifle numbers. The ratio for elites is a lot higher for hand cannons, and so you're going to see them overrepresented in some of the upper tiers, even though their minor DPS is not as high as some of the other weapons that they're surrounded by. So rapid fire LMGs, we already talked about this. Rapid fire LMGs, again, recoil issues a little bit, total damage, not very good, and the increased minor DPS is not that useful in the content that you're likely to use a rapid fire LMG for. Heavy burst pulses. Heavy burst pulses, in my opinion, are the best overall safe ad cleared primary. That's a lot of qualifiers, but this thing has 26,568 minor DPS. That's really high. The only primary that is higher minor DPS than a heavy burst pulse rifle is the lightweight sidearm. And the lightweight sidearm, mind you, is half the range, a hell of a lot more difficult to control, hell of a lot more difficult to rack up crits on this thing. So the heavy burst pulse rifle stands head and shoulders above every other non-sidearm archetype, the next of course being another pulse rifle. So another example of Bungie creating a primary archetype that has no downside and is just better than all the other primaries within that weapon family. Heavy burst pulse rifle, nice, pretty good stuff, nice. Next up, high impact and precision frame rockets. These are here because they're a bit more niche than aggressive and adaptive rockets. Aggressive and adaptive rockets obviously do well in terms of total damage. They do well in terms of DPS. High impacts and precisions have a bit more total damage, right? Because they have more rockets, but the DPS hit that you take by using them is a bit much, and it does kind of gate them from being used in, more optimized content. So that's why they're in the B tier. They're a bit more niche. They're not as commonly seen as something like an Apex Predator or a Cold Comfort. Next up, we have aggressive shotguns. This might be a bit controversial. I know some people definitely don't like using aggressive shotguns in PvE because they have low base handling. They have really low fire rate. It's kind of awkward feeling to use them. You have to be really up close to use them properly, right? 4.62 fall off range. However, aggressive shotguns have very respectable DPS when it comes to using trench barrel. Their per shot damage is really respectable. If you ever get like a recombination aggressive shotgun, really good for stuff like champs, majors, whatever. So yeah, I personally have kind of taken a liking to aggressive shotguns recently. They have an excellent damage profile if you're willing to overlook the quality of life that it takes to use them. I can see some people totally like putting this in the C tier, but for me personally, they're in the B tier. Rapid fire snipers, you might be surprised to not see them a bit higher. Something that surprised me about rapid fire snipers is that they have really high red bar DPS. I'm not sure why snipers have a 2.08 times multiplier to miners, despite the fact that snipers are very explicitly not ad clear weapons. So I don't know, if Bungie ever makes a sniper that's like really good for ad clear for some reason, it'll be good, right? They have really high miner DPS scalars. I'm not sure why. Don't ask me. I just read the numbers. I don't make the numbers. Okay, so rapid fire snipers, in my opinion, right, they're strong for sure, right? If we're gonna look at some stuff later, but in terms of like boss DPS, they're like up there with shotguns, right? Rapid fire snipers, especially compared to like aggressives and adaptives, they're up there with shotguns, despite the fact that they have essentially infinite range. The only drawback is, of course, snipers have very, very unforgiving precision hit ratios, so crit requirements. And I do think rapid fire snipers with the current damage meta and the current like GM roam meta, you know, they're good, like mathematically, numerically, they're good, but in terms of like usage rates and like when you would actually use them, they're still pretty niche in my opinion. Damage rotations, kind of uncommon in my opinion. Would you use them in like a GM? Even with like a sandbox right now, with the artifact that we have right now, the Sniper's Meditation, you could use like a Solar 140 if you want, but still it feels a bit clunky to use a rapid fire sniper when you could be using a rocket sidearm or like an area denial or like an exotic, right? So it is kind of awkward to use rapid fire snipers right now in my opinion, even though their damage profile doesn't betray that. That's kind of my opinion on rapid fire snipers. They're still a bit niche to be placed in something like the A tier. Finally, aggressive and lightweight swords. So that's these two right here. Lightweight swords, really, really excellent total damage, right? If we're looking at this like 3 mil, this is actually like tripled, quadrupled when you have Relentless. So absolutely mind-boggling amounts of total damage. DPS values still a little bit lacking compared to the A tier stuff. Just to give you some references, A tier we're looking 99k, 85k, 85k, right? You got them down to the B tier, the swords 75k, 69k, not great, right? Not the same. So the only reason these are here is because I think, first of all, lightweights, their claim to fame is the crazy total damage, right? And aggressives, their claim to fame, well, first of all, I hope they interact with Pack Hunter correctly sooner than later. And once that changes, they might move up to the A tier. I know it says Pack Hunter, but this is non-Pack Hunter numbers because obviously they don't work with Pack Hunter right now, so I wasn't able to get those numbers. But aggressives are still among the better archetypes for like roam content. They have very high guard stats, and I know a lot of Titan players vastly prefer using this archetype over others for roam content. So that's why I put it in the B tier instead of in like the C tier. So that's enough for the B tier. Let's move on to the C tier next. C tier, the description is strictly disadvantageous or extremely niche plus good primaries. Okay, so double fire BGLs, they're kind of like Mountaintop in terms of damage profile. They have almost the exact same damage profile. They're obviously good for blinding. Mountaintop doesn't have blinding, but Mountaintop does have movement, right? And in a sandbox where blinding GLs are not used that much anymore, double fires kind of had to take a hit here compared to micro missiles, compared to area denials. So I did put them in the C tier. I think, in terms of damage rotations too, I don't know. I really do think breach GLs need a bit of a buff from Bungie for them to be more relevant, because manually reloading this thing, DPS is dog shit. Swap DPSing this thing, it's okay, right? Like, it's okay. It leads to a really awkward imbalance where you only shoot one BGL shot compared to whatever you're shooting from your heavy and your kinetic slot. So you often end up with a lot of leftover ammo in your energy slot compared to something like a sniper. So a bit awkward to use in my opinion. And on top of that, it's like their damage profile, I feel like they should just offer more given how clunky it is to use breach GLs in the current sandbox. So that's just my opinion on BGLs. They are the best blinding archetype though, so I did put them in the C tier. Lightweight GLs are going to be even lower than this, not to spoil anything, but yeah, that's why they're in the C tier. Compressed waveframes. Now, compressed waveframes are kind of awkward, right? Because they're trying to do two things at the same time. They're trying to both be a usable boss DPS weapon, which they're okay in that regard, but they're also trying to be good for minor ad clear, which they are good for minor ad clear, but the main problem here is look at this total damage. This total damage is rough. It is rough. You have 1.77 million total damage to miners. A rocket sidearm has almost 2 million. So it's like a heavy weapon isn't competing in the total damage front. In my opinion, we're going to make this another video too. I think Bungie should shift this weapon more towards total damage and less towards DPS, because no one is using this thing for DPS. I'm pretty sure compressed waveframes also have the same issue that the waveframe swords do, where like multiple of them don't register correctly when multiple players are using them. So it is really easy to use, don't get me wrong, right? It's probably even easier to use than like an adaptive GL or a rapid fire GL, as long as the boss is on the ground. It's surprisingly close, right? I'm going to show you guys a graph later on, probably in the next video, where we show the clusters of all the different archetypes on a, on a graph like total damage versus DPS. And the dot for compressed waves is really, really close to adaptives and rapids, but I just don't think there's a place for it, right? It's like it's trying to do two things at once and it kind of fails at both of them, which is why I put it in the C tier. Because are you more likely to use a compressed waveframe like Hullabaloo, or are you more likely to use like Supremacy or like Semiotician? And the answer is like to any player that's sane, it's like pretty obvious, right? So that's why they're in the C tier. If Bungie does the right thing and pushes these guys more towards total damage, more toward their ad clear potential, right, as a more like burstier spam option that works to clear a room really, really quickly without Pack Hunter, then I think this will move probably more towards the B tier where the special wayframes are. But for now, I don't think they're as good as special wayframes, and I also don't think they're as good as really anything in the B tier. Rapid fire fusions are in the C tier. You might be surprised, you know, a lot of people like rapid fire fusions. Why aren't they in the B tier? Rapid fire fusions, I think fusions are punished a little too heavily. Now, if you look at the way Bungie designs weapon archetypes, right? Weapon archetypes that are easier to use and are, you know, have less punishing range values, for example, have lower damage because it's easier to use them, right? So if you take a greater risk and you use something like a shotgun, or you take a greater risk in terms of having to hit crits and use something like a sniper, you do more damage, right? But I think fusions are still punished a little too much for their ease of use, right? So fusion rifles, I think they could use a bit of a damage buff compared to some of the other archetypes that we have special weapon wise, because the damage numbers here really don't compete. If you look at the boss DPS numbers, 37.7k, let's compare to like rapid fire snipers, 50k, right? Significantly higher. Let's go to rapid fire shotguns. What is it? 59k, 59.6k, right? That's a big jump. That's a huge jump. So I do think fusions are still a bit of an underperformer. Yes, they're very easy to use, but I don't think that's enough to kind of push them above the C tier, where there's a lot of like, you know, respectable archetypes, right? It's not like that bad. C tier is not the worst placement in the world. In fact, C tier is what, like in the middle of the tier list? Yeah, C tier is in the middle of the tier list. There's up to F tier on this tier list. So adaptive, aggressive burst, lightweight / legacy PR55, and rapid fire pulses. I talked to some people in my chat that use pulses a fair amount, and they said that outside of like high impacts, most pulse rifle archetypes feel pretty much the same. I've used aggressive burst pulse rifles before, like Insidious. I've used lightweight pulse rifles before, like Chattering Bone. They all feel kind of similar, and like numerically compared to the other primary families, the archetypes have like almost the same numbers, right? Elite DPS, minor DPS, boss DPS, like, you know, they're all kind of the same. Range values are all like 30, 37. Like aggressive burst pulses are like a little bit higher than the others, but they're all pretty much the same, right? So take it or leave it, you know, just take your pick. What about lightweight shotguns? Lightweight shotguns. Okay, so lightweight shotguns used to be relatively favored by the community because they were really, really nice for 1-2 punching, right? Lightweight shotguns, they have high handling, you get the move speed bonus, they have good max size, pretty good stuff. The only problem I have with lightweight shotguns is, number one, Perfect Paradox exists now, and Perfect Paradox is like the 1-2 punch shotgun in the kinetic slot. Before, you can make the argument, oh, Swordbreaker is good in the kinetic slot, or, you know, Wastelander is good in the kinetic slot, and you can't really make that argument anymore. Obviously, this is an archetype tier list, so I shouldn't really be referencing like specific options because, you know, archetypes are archetypes on their own merits. And so lightweight shotguns, the big problem with them is their total damage. These things get so little, the amount of shotgun shots that you get is just so pathetic compared to other archetypes. You get 22 shots. You get 22 shots. For reference, let's go to aggressive shotguns, right? You get 26, right? Normally, when Bungie makes slower firing archetypes, right, you get less total shots. You get less total shots because they do more damage per shot. And yet you have aggressive shotguns, which do 26 total shots. And for some reason, lightweight shotguns only do 22. They don't get 22. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. So the total damage on these things, really horrible. Damage profile is fine. Damage profile is fine. But, you know, lightweight shotguns are one of the examples of like an underperforming archetype, which we'll talk about when I think probably the end of this video, we'll talk about underperforming archetypes. But lightweight shotguns, I don't know why. They only get 22 shots. They should get more shots. If they get more shots, probably move them up a tier. I don't see why you would use a lightweight over something like a rapid, like ever. Unless you're doing maybe like pellet swapping, which is mostly dead in the current meta. Slug shotguns are kind of in like an awkward place. Their DPS is okay. You know, obviously recombination, they have good range. You can use them for a major burst in that way. But outside of that, you know, they don't really do much. They have good total damage for a special weapon if you account for the fact that they get 4 times a charm. I think 4 times a charm on slugs is a little underrated. I don't think it's like meta or anything. Yeah, I do think slugs are just not particularly useful in the current meta. In theory, they're like not that bad, but I do think that they should probably do more damage given that they have a precision requirement compared to the other weapons on this list. And next up, we have lightweight sidearm. Now, originally, I had lightweight sidearm a bit lower, and that's because sidearms, especially the lightweight sidearm, are relatively difficult to control, even if you're on controller, right? It's kind of difficult to hit consistent crits with these things, especially if your target is within sidearm range and moving rapidly. On top of that, you know, sidearms have very limited range, you know, some of the lowest range in the sandbox shared with like the SMG range tier. However, it is kind of hard to ignore this number. Lightweight sidearms are a huge overperformer when it comes to minor DPS for whatever reason. They have an insanely high 30.6k minor DPS, which is like an entire tier's worth of minor DPS above the next option, which is heavy burst pulse rifles. Even if sidearms are kind of unforgiving, the number is so high that it kind of doesn't matter. Aggressive snipers, what they have going for them is basically just per shot damage. They have per shot damage and they have decent ammo economy. Now, the problem with aggressive snipers is that their mag size is relatively small, so you have to use an option like reconstruction if you want to have a nice big mag size. You only get 5 in the mag maximum, even with, you know, a depth mag, with extended mag, all that stuff. On top of that, if you look at aggressive snipers, it's 912k. If we go up to rapid fire snipers, which, yeah, it's like 869k, right? So the total damage values are almost identical. Because of that, aggressive snipers, I don't see much use for them besides like maybe GMs where you have like a recombination succession or something and you want to shoot a champ with it. Besides that, they're not that great. Every perk combo that you would want on an aggressive sniper would probably function better on a rapid fire sniper. For example, like the chill clip chaos reshaped roll that I like on critical anomaly. If I had that on supremacy, you bet your ass I'd be using it on supremacy, or like Aerokonji, right? Because it's stasis. So yeah, that's pretty much it for aggressive snipers. They're kind of just objectively worse than rapids in almost every way, but they do a per shot damage going for them, which you can't say about adaptives. Vortex swords are another example of an underperforming archetype. I'm not going to talk too much about underperforming, overperforming anymore, because there's a whole section at the end of this video that I have to get to where I'm going to talk about that. So Vortex swords, main thing here is total damage, even with Relentless and Pack Hunter in the mix, kind of pathetic, right? Because 6 ammo per heavy attack. No other sword uses 6 ammo per heavy attack. So this thing eats through ammo super quickly, number one. And number two, DPS is just not even that great. It's not even that great, right? Like if you go up here, lightweights do more DPS. Lightweights do more DPS. The most ammo efficient sword archetype does higher DPS than the least ammo efficient sword archetype. If these are so bad, why are they in the C tier, right? Isn't there like some decent stuff in the C tier? Well, I do account for everything that an archetype is used for, and Vortex frame swords are the best swords for eager edge movement. So that's why they're in the C tier. That's why they're not in the D tier or in the E tier or whatever. I suppose their heavy attack is like okay for ad clear or for like dealing with a major if you don't care about ammo requirements. So there's that too. But the main thing is, yeah, just movement. That's it. Finally, we have trace rifles. Trace rifles, I used to be a big trace rifle stan, a big trace rifle fan. The problem with trace rifles is that, you know, rocket sidearms just do their job better, right? Rocket sidearms just do their job better. Total damage, I mean, absolutely destroyed, right? Literally 2 times the total damage, right? Minor DPS, elite DPS, even after the trace rifle bust from like last season, still absolutely pathetic compared to rocket sidearms. The only reason why you would ever use a trace rifle now is for special ammo shoot to loot and for like shooting objectives where you need to swap your trace rifle to another special weapon, which is really only relevant for like speedrunners and like low miners. So if you're not doing either of those things, I don't know why you would ever use a trace rifle, unfortunately. Now, is a trace rifle like completely unusable? No, it still has some use cases, which is why it's in the C tier. Extremely niche, fits kind of the tier description. Let's go ahead and talk about the D tier next. Last 3 tiers are going to be hopefully a little bit faster because they are mostly primaries. So D tier, I've described it as alternatives within suboptimal weapon families or decent primaries. So what that means is if there is a weapon family, for example, fusion rifles or glaives that are not very good, and we have alternatives to the best options within those suboptimal weapon families, that's what's going to be in the D tier. First, we have adaptive and lightweight and rapid autos. So lightweight and rapid autos are the same thing, right? Lightweights just have the same damage profile. They're just better stats, I suppose. Not enough to like move it into C tier or anything. Auto rifles, you got to give it to them for being like decent mid-range options, very easy to use, very easy to like hit shots with an auto rifle, right? Very easy to spam with. Elite DPS, not particularly great compared to sidearms and hand cannons. You'll notice the auto rifle archetypes, about half of them are in the D tier. I think the other half are in the E tier because I think high impacts and precisions do take a bit much of a hit on the minor DPS value. Next up, we have lightweight and precision bows. Now the thing about bows, there's some unquantifiables here that we got to talk about, right? So first of all, bows have infinite range. So the only thing they compete with is scout rifles. And I think bows are better than scout rifles for a number of reasons. You'll notice that there are essentially no scout rifles in the D tier, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, there are none. And the reason for that is this. Bows are good at all engagement distances, right? With scouts, if you play close range, you either have to like move your mouse or controller or whatever like a lot, or you have to hip fire, which is like really suboptimal with most scout archetypes. Even on the aggressive scout, it is kind of awkward to hip fire with it. All scout rifles aren't DMT. Whereas bows, it's really comfortable, really easy to use them hip fired or even to use them ADS at close range. And so bows are great at all ranges. They have excellent per shot damage, which is something that we praised hand cannons for. They have excellent interactions with on-hit perks like Volt Shot and Dragonfly, which is now available on non-denouement. And the only problem with bows is really that they kind of struggle with elite DPS. As you can see here, I mean, I wouldn't recommend plinking away at a champ with a bow anyway, but if you wanted to, the elite scaler is pretty mediocre, right? It's pretty mediocre, even compared to like the average primary, like an auto rifle, not great, right? So bows, pretty decent, right? Their DPS value, I think, is a little underrepresented here because a lot of them get Archer's Tempo, but I do think the best bows today, you know, kind of don't use Archer's Tempo or use like 2 splash perks. So yeah, bows, I'd say they're better than scouts overall. Lightweight BGLs are some of the worst specials out there. They're worse than double fires in every way. So this is, again, we're gonna have this talk again, but Bungie likes making archetypes that are just better than the other archetypes in a weapons family with no downside. And so I guess the lightweight downside, the double fire downside, I should say, is like the stats are a little worse than lightweights, right? They have lower reload and handling, but like that's not really that big of a deal. And the damage difference is crazy, right? Like if you look at the DPS here, boss DPS, lightweight GL, 19,813. Keep that number in your mind, 19,813. Look at double fires, 26,206 with the exact same total shot count. Just absolutely shameful. Lightweight GLs. You can use them for blinding if you want, but again, they're just worse than double fires, right? Double fires have 2 projectiles, lightweights have 1, same ammo economy, blah, blah, blah. Next up, precision heavy GLs. Some of you have probably never even heard of this archetype, and that's because there are no legendary weapons with this archetype. There is the Penumbra GSM, I think, which is like a green drum GL that has this archetype. I only included this because I found out about it and I was like, I don't know, Bungie might make a legendary with this archetype someday. I don't know, maybe. If they do, it's gonna suck though, because the base damage value is really horrible, total damage value really horrible. If Bungie ever makes HCL with this thing, it's gonna need like a crazy perk combination to be relevant. Adaptive fusion rifles are similar total to rapid fires, but they lose out in DPS by a fair chunk, right? The difference between adaptives and rapids is bigger than the difference between adaptives and high impacts, aggressives, adaptives. These are all way closer than the difference between adaptives and rapids, so it's a fair chunk. Aggressive fusions. Now, you might be surprised, a lot of people rank aggressive fusions as some of the worst legendary archetypes in the game. People really hate Coriolis Force, for example. In my opinion, aggressive fusions are a bit overhated. We did a little bit of research when it comes to how the spread works, how it comes out, whether it's actually maybe usable in PvE, and the horizontal spread is actually really not that bad. It's relatively tight. It comes out instantly, kind of like Bastion does. Like imagine Bastion, but instead of shooting like 3 bursts, it shot just 1, and the burst was like a line, like a horizontal line, right? So the burst is actually quite tight. In my opinion, if you're going to use a fusion rifle in PvE, like in the typical engagement distance that you use a fusion rifle at, which is like 2 shotgun kill lengths, right? Like 15 meters, the bolts will all hit most enemies, right? Unless the enemy is like very thin, like a fanatic or something, you're going to hit all the bolts. So realistically speaking, I don't really think it's that bad in terms of horizontal spread and respectable DPS in total, right? The DPS of this thing is like basically the same as an adaptive, which is decent, and the total damage is significantly higher. So I think aggressives, in my opinion, if they get like a little bit of a buff, or if we get an aggressive fusion that is not Coriolis Force, right? We get one with like controlled burst or something, this will actually be a respectable archetype. It has close to the total damage of a high impact, except for it has no charge time issue that the high impacts have, right? Or not as big of a charge time issue. So not bad, I think overhated. And finally, high impacts, right? High impacts, king of fusion total damage. Their total damage rivals other special weapon types that are far superior when it comes to total damage. DPS wise, okay, right? Not too bad. If we're looking at DPS and we're comparing to some of the other archetypes out there that have really slow firing archetypes, DPS is pretty comparable to the faster firing stuff, right? So the only problem is, you know, charge time, pretty rough. If you ignore the charge time, not bad. Next up, we have adaptive and rapid glaives. Glaives are maybe the most unique weapon type in Destiny when it comes to legendaries because they are kind of strictly defensive, right? Their offensive damage profiles are okay. In fact, I think offensively, glaives are some of the most balanced weapons in Destiny because their damage profiles, I think, do punish them just enough to be a defensive weapon. The problem is that if you use a glaive defensively, your offensive potential kind of goes away, especially when using like other weapons. If you want to use other weapons or like abilities, you kind of are forced to play on standby. And I think a lot of the playstyles that are more optimal or even more consistent in today's meta don't really favor that kind of playstyle. So glaives, you kind of have to sacrifice one of your weapon slots for a strictly defensive purpose, which is generally not the greatest. You know, support from auto rifles are kind of also a defensive option, or they're not like completely lacking in offensive capability. So I don't know, glaives are just kind of in this awkward place, right? And if you're wondering why aggressive glaives are missing here, it's because aggressive glaives have no shield duration benefits. So they have nerf shield duration versus adaptives. They have pretty low DPS in terms of scaling up and getting your shield up. And of course, they have horrible stats. So that's why they're in the E tier. That quality of life difference was enough to bump them down A tier. This is a bit rough, right? Linears in the D tier. The only, I think, heavy weapon archetype besides precision HGLs, which are basically not real. That's because linears don't really know what they want to do. They don't really know what they want to do. That's my main critique, right? In my opinion, from a design perspective, linears look like they want to be the machine guns of boss damage. So what do I mean by that? Machine guns, they are not super crazy when it comes to splash damage or crazy fast ad clear, right? They're single target options, but they have very, very high total damage to miners. Linears, I think, are trying to do that. They have range, or they're trying to have, I guess, total damage to bosses, but their DPS is not that high. But they're kind of failing on all three fronts, right? Number one, infinite range is, I don't know. Most of the heavy weapons that are available in this game besides swords are kind of competitive at all ranges. The boss DPS is so low that it's literally lower than special weapons that have similar precision hit requirements. Like, let me give you an example, right? Let's go to rapid fire snipers. 50k, just remember this. 50k DPS, 50k DPS. Let's go down to linears. Linears, 45k. 45k for the archetype that sacrifices total damage by not having access to 4 times a charm or triple tap. 45k. So it's pretty crazy that you have a heavy weapon archetype that is designed for damage to elites or bosses. Obviously not designed for ad clear. It's a single target weapon. And it does lower DPS than a rapid fire sniper. It's not even a shotgun, a rapid fire sniper, right? They have the same drawbacks. They're both infinite range weapons that are punished if you miss crits. And yet we have a heavy weapon that's doing less than a special. So pretty rough. And then even if you look at the total damage, which precisions with 4 times a charm hit like 2.4, right? Hit 2.4, 2.5. It's still like pathetic. It's still pathetic, right? Like it's still significantly lower than where I think it should be. We're going to talk about like total damage and where I think weapons should end up in the next video again. Also, one more thing. I think precision linears are a little overlooked right now. A lot of people perceive adaptive linears as just being the better archetype, period. But you have to remember, precision linears have almost the same DPS value as adaptive linears, right? Even though it may not seem that way, they have almost the same raw DPS value. The only difference is that precision linears haven't really had a good option come out in the recent past. You have 4 times a charm bait, which is pretty strong, but imagine you had 4 times a charm surrounded or 4 times a charm and like chaos reshaped. That linear would, I think, overshadow something like scintillation. So that's just something to keep in mind. A lot of people are not kind of paying attention to precision linears because we haven't had a good option recently, but I think if a good option comes out, it'll be pretty viable in the linear context, which is not really viable. Moving on, high impact pulses. I already talked about this. These feel really bad to use in PvE. They have similar stats to the other pulse rifles that I put in the C tier, but they just like feel really bad, at least in my opinion. And I think most of the people in my chat agree with me, so they're in the D tier. Precision shotguns, easily the worst shotgun archetype when it comes to DPS, pretty pathetic. When it comes to total damage, not that great. You can make an argument that this is like an okay 1-2 punch archetype because the total damage is higher than rapid fires, but it has a lower shot count. But the shot count difference is not that large. It's like 25, right? It's not too bad. It's like if you wanted like a mix of like an aggressive shotgun and a rapid shotgun and you wanted to use it for like 1-2 punch. I don't know. It's just this really weird limbo where like I don't think you'd ever want to use this archetype. It's not like downright unacceptable. Let's say you got like a precision shotgun with like a perk combo that's so good it's never been seen on any other shotgun, like people would still use it. But the actual archetype itself, if we're ranking it on its own merits, there's like no reason to ever really pick this thing up. Next up, we have some sidearms: adaptive, adaptive burst, and rapid fire sidearms. So these sidearms are any of the sidearms that we found to have decent damage profiles. So these are all decent damage profiles. They're competing with like heavy burst pulses. However, these are also the tap fire sidearms, right? So the sidearms that it's not too awkward to hit crits with. They all kind of emulate what a lightweight does. Rapid fires almost kind of feel like a close range auto rifle, pretty easy to use. This is kind of like a close range pulse rifle, but it doesn't feel that awkward in my experience. Kind of like easier to use, not horrible damage model or weapon models. Finally, adaptive snipers. Adaptive snipers are just kind of like the forgotten child of the sniper family. The spec changes kind of did them a favor, because before with adaptives, if you wanted to hit 7 in the mag like rapids, you had to use backup mag and you'd have to give up boss spec. Well, now everyone's using backup mag on everything. And so because of that, adaptives now have the same peak mag size as rapids. Now, the only problem is they don't do anything. They don't do anything in particular, right? They're worse in terms of DPS. They're not competitive for total damage. They're just worse in every way. So adaptives also don't have the per shot damage advantage that, you know, aggressive snipers do, like Succession. So there's not really a reason to use adaptives. They're obviously favored in like PvP, but for the most part, not really relevant in PvE. E tier consists of awful specials and mediocre primaries. That is the label of the tier. Let's talk about it. So auto rifles, we talked about it. High impact frame, precision frame. You lose a little too much DPS here, and the range advantage compared to the other auto rifle archetypes is not significant enough, in my opinion, to really warrant using these. Now, I have praised auto rifles like Abyss Defiant in the past because of their very, you know, potent perk combinations, and 36 meters of range is like pretty decent. They're just mediocre. They're just okay. If you ever find one with like a really, really good perk combination that's not available on other autos, certainly competitive with other autos, but if we're getting kind of granular within the lower tiers here, I think they are deserving, at least feel-wise, of being lower than the D tier autos. fusion rifles, we have precision fusions. This is a huge step below the other fusion rifles. I don't know why. Total damage is really bad. Minor DPS is really bad. I'm not sure why. Precision fusions are kind of like an outlier that underperforms where they should be in the line for charge time. I know like most people are aware that like special weapons or heavy weapons, they all kind of have this thing where like higher total damage equals lower DPS, and it's kind of like a linear thing going on. Well, precision fusions are kind of below that trend for some reason, so they're in the E tier. They kind of underperform. I know a lot of people like certain examples of fusion rifles, right? For example, like Deliverance, which is why, you know, perk combos can kind of outshine how bad an archetype can be. But if we're just ranking on an archetype's merits alone, it's pretty bad. A lot of D tier fusions, right? We say that, you know, they're not that great, but like this is even worse. Aggressive glaives, already talked about this. Horrible stats, no shield duration increase, longest time to get shield charged. Lightweight, precision, and rapid fire scouts. These are like the better scouts of the scout families. Scout rifles are easily some of the worst primary families in the game right now because they have a very high range, but they're awkward to use at the most relevant engagement range, which in Destiny is between like that 15 to 30 meter range. That's usually where you're going to be engaging with targets. And scout rifles just are really, really awkward to use in that range to hit crits with. They also have horrible elite DPS, and they don't really have any particular like useful unique quirks. Their per shot damage isn't particularly high. But yeah, I mean, their DPS values are okay. And if you're ever in like, you know, you want to really, really play safe and you're in like a really long range engagement, I guess scouts are okay, but I'd probably still rather use bows, to be honest. Next up, we have heavy burst sidearms. You might be surprised about this. Heavy burst sidearms actually have a pretty decent damage profile, but at least in the video footage that I saw, it looks quite annoying to hit the 2 burst of crits on like moving targets compared to the sidearm archetypes where you're just spamming like rapids or like lightweights. So that's why I decided to put them in the E tier. I know some people do like breach light, but I do think the feel of a sidearm is relatively important to its usability, especially given that you're using them at melee range where enemies, you have to turn your camera, you know, to a greater degree when enemies move the same distance compared to like if they were far away, right? So that's why they're in the E tier. And finally, to round things out on the in the E tier, we have the SMGs, all 4 SMGs. SMGs, really rough right now. It's no secret, right? Some of the lowest DPS values across the entire sandbox when it comes to minor DPS. Their elite DPS is pretty decent, and I guess they get a shout out for boss DPS too because they don't get punished too much. But in terms of like what they do, their fall off range kind of is shared with sidearms, and sidearms obviously pack a much bigger punch. We're talking literally like SMGs are like the bottom end of primary DPS, and then sidearms are like at the top end, and they share the same range. And SMGs sometimes have recoil issues. They have really low base reload compared to sidearms. It's like, you know, they occupy the same range space, but like SMGs are just so much worse. They're just so much worse, right? So the only thing I can give SMGs is like they have some level of quality of life. They feel kind of decent to use, even if their damage is really low, which is not something I can say for the F tier stuff. So the F tier is going to be awful quality of life and feel primaries, right? So stuff like 120 hand cannons with their famously horrible base reload, aggressive scouts with their really segmented reload, so you have to like reload a bunch of times to reload them fully. This is like competing with like machine gun levels of bad, right? So pretty rough. Damage profile is not bad, right? They definitely buff this thing to be like more usable compared to the other scout rifle archetypes. And you could say that like, you know, stuff like Time Worn Wayfarer, you can proc like heal clip or like kill clip off of just one segmented reload, which is really fast. The actual usability of the scout rifle doesn't really change because of this fact. And I feel like bows are just better, and the other scout rifle archetypes are just better, even with these like kind of niche advantages. High impact scouts, absolutely awful. I don't think really need to like discuss this. High impact scouts are some of the worst feeling primaries in the game. And finally, precision sidearms. The note that I have here for precision sidearm is damage profile of an auto rifle with the disadvantages of a sidearm. And that's pretty much accurate, right? This thing has 18.5k minor DPS, which is horrible for a sidearm. Horrible. Okay. Okay, you know what? Let me show you. Okay. Look at the sidearms here, right? Do you see this? You see this? You have, okay, lightweight sidearms, 30k, everything else like 24k, 23k. And then you have this guy, 18.5k. 18.5k. Why? Anyways, horrible stuff. Don't use it. Really bad. It's like a sidearm with like the downsides of a sidearm, except with none of the upsides of a sidearm. Also, just to be clear, none of these placements are ordered within tiers. I tried to make an order, like a rank system within tiers. It didn't end up working out because it's like almost impossible to compare. Like, how do you compare the difference between like a rocket and like a GL and like a shotgun and like a rocket? It's not possible, right? So I just kind of grouped them into groups of viability. there's no ranking within tiers for this tier list. We spent a long time making this spreadsheet, so I hope you guys find it pretty useful. There's a lot of metrics here that I think are not typically compared. I don't think anybody's ever made a minor DPS comparison for non-primary weapons, so that's pretty cool. Certainly not an elite DPS comparison as well. You have minor total damage, boss total damage, per brick damage comparisons, which are really cool. Shout out to Mossy for his brick math tab in his outgoing damage spreadsheet, which is pretty awesome. Or sorry, I think it's in his it's in his ammo database, I think. We have some cool range values, reload values, basically everything you would ever want to compare Destiny archetypes at a very macro level, right? So yeah, I think this kind of content is pretty cool. I hope you guys are enjoying it as well. I know my content has recently leaned away from like macro level analysis, and I think I want to move back into that territory now that we're kind of moving away from tier lists a little bit, now that I'm done for this season / episode. So yeah, I'm excited to make more content like this, talking about the sandbox, and trying to make the game more healthy and more diverse and more exciting to play, and trying to not have linears be so bad maybe. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you have any comments, questions, concerns, feedback, maybe I hated too much on your favorite pulse rifle archetype, let me know. And but I do feel like this tier list is one of my best. It is, I think, quite accurate. Maybe a little bit too much priority on like the optimal stuff, but really legendary heavy weapons don't really have good damage options that have high total damage, to be honest. So maybe not so much. Yeah, that's pretty much it. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one, where we are going to talk about specific values and be like, yo, I think linears need to be buffed by 15% for them to be healthy, and this is why. So yeah, goodbye for now.